Hello everyone, this is Will from Applied Virtue. It's been a while, so let's kick things off by diving into the ongoing controversy around so-called Goonergate. I want to focus on the video that arguably coined the term, Smash JT's video entitled Goonergate Explained. In this video, Smash JT, or Jeff, throws out some big claims that criticizing titillating video games is anti-freedom, and
having religion control anything is not a great idea.
But do his arguments hold up? Let's take a closer look. The Smash JT channel, for those who aren't aware, consists of Jeff's commentary on the gaming industry and the culture wars surrounding it. He positions himself as a champion of free speech and artistic integrity in the context of criticizing woke politics in gaming. His videos largely cover how left-leaning game developers impose their ideological agendas on players. Yet in this latest video, he claims that religious or conservative voices speaking out against overly sexualized content are the bad guys, positioning their criticism as being opposed to the free market. In essence, he claims that their criticism is inherently coercive and anti-freedom. Jeff's equivocation of conservative criticism and censorship reveals a paradox in his beliefs about freedom and morality. To him, even criticizing sexualized content in video games, especially from a religious perspective, is a step toward censorship and coercion, if not outright censorious in itself. We know this because he pits online commentator Dread Roberts' criticism and the concept of the free market, implying that religion is inherently at odds with individual liberty. This ironically echoes the belief of woke leftists who see theocrats and Christian nationalists as a threat to their rights and, by that reasoning, call for their censorship and political persecution. However, when Jeff criticizes developers for pushing woke politics into games, isn't he also applying a moral lens to artistic expression? Isn't he also critiquing game developers and how they make their products? Why is it acceptable for him to do that, but not others? Jeff's criticisms of woke game developers and conservatives presupposes a moral worldview, one he's hoping to sway his audience and the industry itself towards. This shows that Jeff has no problem imposing his ideological positions onto the so-called free market. The root of Jeff's ideological framework, I believe, is the belief in neutral institutions. Liberal ideology holds that public-facing institutions, be they gaming companies, schools, or media outlets, should be free of moral or political influence in order to maximize individual liberty. In such an environment, the individual would be free to choose his perspective and not have one forced upon him by powerful institutions. We see this in Jeff's insistence that he does not care about the personal beliefs of others, so long as they stay out of his games. The problem with this perspective is that this neutrality is an illusion. A company that chooses to include titillating content has made a moral decision, just as a company that removes such content has. When it comes to governing the direction of an institution, every choice, whether it's adding or removing titillating content, reflects a moral worldview. Here's the kicker. If Jeff sees conservative critique as a threat to neutrality, then neutrality itself can't be neutral towards conservatism. Thus, by excluding such critiques from public discourse, Jeff is enforcing his own set of moral values, ones that elevate secularism and libertarian ideals over traditional or religious ones. This is a glaring hypocrisy not only in his worldview, but also in the liberal perspective, one that can have devastating consequences. If conservatives trying to influence public opinion amounts to coercion, then it's justified to use coercion against conservative critics. This is, ironically, the justification used by the woke left to censor conservatives who go against their ideological viewpoint. Remember, hate speech is violence. Don't believe me? Here is an argument made by Herbert Marcuse, a neo-Marxist academic whose ideology helped inspire wokeness. In his essay, Repressive Tolerance, Marcuse argues along the same lines as the woke, using the same logic Jeff uses in his video. Quote, "The small and powerless minorities which struggle against false consciousness and its beneficiaries must be helped. Their continued existence is more important than the preservation of abused rights and liberties which grant constitutional powers to those who oppress these minorities. It should be evident by now that the exercise of civil rights by those who don't have them presupposes the withdrawal of civil rights from those who prevent their exercise, and that the liberation of the damned of the earth presupposes suppression not only of their old, but also of their new masters. Withdrawal of tolerance from regressive movements before they can become active, intolerance even toward thought, opinion, and word, and finally, intolerance in the opposite direction, that is, toward the self-styled conservatives, to the political right. These anti-democratic notions respond to the actual development of the democratic society, which has destroyed the basis for universal tolerance. The conditions under which tolerance can again become a liberating and humanizing force have still to be created. When tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition and to render men immune against each other and better forms of life, then tolerance has been perverted. And when this perversion starts in the mind of the individual, in his consciousness, his needs, when heteronomous interests occupy him before he can experience his servitude, then the efforts to counteract his dehumanization must begin at the place of entrance, there where the false consciousness takes form, or rather is systematically formed. It must begin with stopping the words and images which feed this consciousness. To be sure, this is censorship, even pre-censorship, but openly directed against the more or less hidden censorship that permeates the free media." End quote. Now, Jeff might respond by saying he doesn't want to censor or oppress anyone. He just wants to keep religion from taking over gaming companies because, in his words,
having religion control anything is not a great idea.
There are two problems with this argument. First, Jeff assumes that religion is inherently oppressive and that religious criticism paves the road to oppression. This is, in essence, the very same premise used by Marcuse and other leftists historically to argue for censorship. Logically, these premises have led and will continue to lead to the same conclusion, even if Jeff doesn't agree with that conclusion. This is because freedom of speech has limits, namely when violence or coercion is brought into the equation. By labeling religious or conservative criticism as censorship, Jeff is saying, in effect, that it is a form of coercion. By implication, then, it is no longer protected by the right to freedom of speech. Second, it's unclear what Jeff is talking about when he says that
having religion control anything is not a great idea.
I assume he's talking about things like the Inquisition, the Crusades, or some other historical crime used by liberals to justify secularism. People who make this argument use an ideological definition of religion that conveniently labels their preferred beliefs as secular and the beliefs they want to keep out of the public square religious. Ironically, these secularists will invoke theological concepts like human rights to do this, which only shows the arbitrary nature of these labels. As a matter of fact, opposition to overly sexualized content isn't particular to any religious tradition. The critique of such content is based on its impact on societal well-being and is rooted in a deep understanding of human psychology and morality. Take the Aristotelian conception of psychology, for instance. Aristotle argued that an individual's moral character, his habits, values, and capacity for self-restraint is heavily shaped by the cultural environment he inhabits. A society whose media caters to vulgar and base desires weakens its citizens' ability to cultivate virtues like chastity, moderation, and rationality. Without these virtues, individuals are more likely to be dominated by their appetites, especially sexual ones, which cloud their judgment and diminish their ability to reason. Think about it. When sexual appetites dominate, people become less focused on rational discourse and more consumed by defending or indulging their proclivities. This is evident in many of today's activist movements, where arguments often revolve around justifying personal desires rather than engaging in reasoned debate. Woke activists are a prime example. Its most extreme advocates appear less concerned with logic and more driven by a fierce need to protect their sexual preferences at all costs. You can see this, for example, in how their arguments tend to rely entirely on fallacious reasoning, as seen in this overview of academic arguments for gay marriage. However, I don't think I need to tell Jeff or his audience that the left has gone completely insane and acts irrationally. What they miss is that the source of this irrationality is the sexual appetites of the woke leftists, appetites that will also dominate the so-called Gooners if they do not rein them in. When critics, religious or not, express a negative opinion of titillating content in video games, they aren't arbitrarily imposing morals. They're addressing a deeper societal problem, the way unchecked indulgence of vulgar media erodes the moral fabric necessary for a society to function effectively. And here's where Smash JT's argument falters. By dismissing these critiques as coercive or anti-freedom, he's effectively saying that the only valid moral framework is his own, one that elevates individual desires over societal well-being. And yes, he can argue for that if he wants, except he never does. He just assumes it and uses scary labels like censorship to tar any other moral worldview as evil, despite his pretense of being neutral. Now, Jeff might argue that his stance is about protecting freedom of expression for game developers. He is not giving license for people to indulge in vulgar desires, but protecting an artist's right to express himself. He wants artists to create whatever they want, with the only regulation being the audiences themselves. Let the free market decide, he might say. But this, too, falls apart under scrutiny. First, let's be clear. Criticism isn't censorship, okay? The religious or conservative voices he labels as censors aren't wielding governmental power to ban games. There's no grand conspiracy of religious groups forcing developers to self-censor their products. People like Razorfist, John De La Rose, Melanie Mack, and Dread Roberts are only consumers who express their preference, just like Jeff does whenever he criticizes woke game developers. If he thinks that criticism itself can be coercive, then he really is no different from the woke on this point. And if he wants to argue for that position, that's fine, but then it'd flatly contradict his asserted beliefs in free expression. He'd also probably lose a lot of his audience that way, given how many people opposed to wokeness are also conservative and religious. Second, Jeff's framing of this issue ignores an important historical context. Freedom of speech in America was never a blank check to promote obscenity or vulgarity in the first place. For much of U.S. history, laws against obscenity coexisted with robust protections for speech and the market economy. Americans traditionally believed that free expression existed to promote reasoned discourse. The purpose wasn't to shield pornographers or vulgar entertainers from accountability. It was to protect those telling unpopular but important truths. Even if conservatives were advocating for stricter content standards in gaming, that wouldn't inherently violate the principle of free expression. Freedom of speech is the freedom to say the truth, not a license to print whatever you want and call it art. By ignoring this historical and philosophical grounding, Jeff's vision of freedom becomes reductive. It prioritizes the unfettered indulgence of individual desires over the societal responsibility to uphold standards that promote virtue and reason. In doing so, his position excludes valid moral critiques from the conversation, ironically acting against the spirit of free expression. So where does this leave us? Jeff's attack on religion and social conservatism isn't just inconsistent with his channel's apparent purpose, it's emblematic of a broader liberal blind spot. His understanding of freedom represents an radical ideology that frames any attempt to impede the propagation of vulgar content, even criticism, as inherently unjust. To him, if someone critiques a game developer for putting transgender ideology in a game, that's fine. But if you critique the same game developer for putting women with large, jiggling assets in a game, that's an unacceptable act of censorship. However, if the gaming industry is to remain a space for meaningful expression, then it must allow for all critique, including the kinds that Jeff considers beyond the pale. Before we wrap up, there's one more concern I'd like to address, something I imagine puzzles some in my audience. Content creators like Melody Mack oppose the woke left's push to uglify video games, that is, making characters look deliberately unattractive and androgynous to subvert the so-called male gaze. At the same time, they also oppose the use of obscenity and overt sexualization in games. I can imagine that to Jeff and other gamers, this might seem inconsistent. How can they oppose both at the same time? The answer lies in the distinction between beauty and sexuality. Beauty and sexuality differ in their overall purpose. Sexuality is inherently transient. It might grab your attention at first, but it ultimately pulls you out of the game because it stirs desires that can only be fulfilled by real-life relationships. Beauty, by contrast, inspires awe. It keeps you immersed, inviting you to linger and marvel. Nobody on the conservative side of things says that attractive characters are in themselves bad, it's the way you present them that's the problem. While sexuality can be virtuous, in the context of media, gratuitous, erotic content has the potential to weaken immersion, while true beauty heightens it, enhancing the gaming experience. While sexuality and beauty are often intertwined and, in the case of depicting attractive female characters, inseparable, the two are not the same thing. You could have beauty without sexuality, as seen in sacred art, or sexuality without beauty, as seen in fetishistic content. Christians and other like-minded critics oppose both woke uglification and Gooner fetishization as being opposed to true beauty. The goal isn't to deny attractiveness or downplay the importance of the visual appeal. Rather, anti-Gooner critics want games that elevate, inspire, and immerse, not cheap thrills or ideological statements. Neither woke critics of the male gaze nor anti-woke defenders of sexual content understand this distinction, leading to misunderstandings. To close out this video, I'd like to invite Jeff to come onto my channel to discuss this subject in greater detail. Open dialogue is the heart of free expression, and I'd love to hear Jeff's thoughts in a meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on my Substack. Until then, have a nice day.